Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, and we're going to talk about COVID-19 and a list called List N of it looks like 400 disinfectants that meet EPA's criteria for use against SARS-CoV-2. So we'll talk about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here today.
What's your role, and how did you intersect with COVID?
I study basically chemical exposures and potential effects on human health, and my focus is on chemicals that are usually in consumer products that we come into contact with in our daily lives, including personal care products, pesticides, and other chemicals. And, the disinfectants that are being used for COVID are considered pesticides.
Oh, really? Pesticides? Huh.
Yes.
So what are some of the, I don't know if you lump hand sanitizer in with this, but what are the top disinfectants used, for SARS-CoV-2 right now?
So let's take a little step back. So, pesticides are designed to repel or kill a particular pest. In this case, one of the reasons why EPA is responsible for registering disinfectants, and we have this, EPA List N, is because disinfectants are considered pesticides, right? They are biocides, which are designed to kill or repel, in this case, viruses. And as of July 30th of this year, there are over 400 approved products on this List N. A little bit over 200 of them were what they call QUATs, or quaternary ammonium compounds, as well as other chemicals. And I want to stress and emphasize that, this is a list of chemicals that could be used as disinfectants. However, they've only, manufacturers, in order to get on this list, they only have to prove its efficacy against the virus. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's on this list that it's safe and it won't increase any risk of long-term health effects. So there is no pre-market safety testing, if you will, of these disinfectants to make it to this list.
Well, these disinfectants aren't new. I mean, what have they been used for historically?
They've been used in healthcare settings, for example, hospitals and other settings in where, viruses are a concern.
Well, but don't they have a lot of health effect data from that?
Not necessarily. We don't know what the long-term health effects for a lot of these chemicals are. We do know from some studies, for example, that a lot of these compounds are, respiratory irritants, dermal irritants. There are also some animal studies showing that they could be reproductive toxicants. And we also know from few studies that they can persist in the environment for a long time, or in the setting in which they're applied to for a while.
Well, so was this ignored, that they were used in healthcare settings? How long have they been used in these settings, and why would they continue to be used if they could have these adverse effects? That's
a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. So I don't know if we want to use that question. I don't know.
Yeah, it's okay if you don't know. That's just surprising. So does it do anything for, so who authorized that these chemicals should be used for SARS-CoV-2, or were they just used because that seemed to be the most accessible thing to do? Has their legal status changed, their health status changed by being on this List N, or by being reviewed by the EPA?
It hasn't changed, and the only thing the manufacturers have to submit is whether it's, efficient against, the virus, not, again, no pre-market safety testing in terms of long-term health effects. Some of the concerns that I have as an exposure scientist is, for example, these disinfectants being applied in schools or other settings where there's vulnerable populations, and have, there are other safer alternatives, such as, increased washing of your hands with soap and water is effective against the virus, wearing your mask. But there are general concerns in my field, as to potential health outcomes on vulnerable populations, including children, elderly, pregnant women, and children as well.
So is your focus to figure out what the health outcomes would be for those vulnerable populations, or what are you working on right now in regards to this?
I'm not directly doing COVID research right now. My research, I have looked at other pesticides in the past, and we know from other pesticides that, exposure to pesticides during critical windows of susceptibility, including pregnancy, for example, could have long-lasting health effects in children or increase the risk of different outcomes, including neurodevelopment, such as behavior and cognition. And there have not been a lot of studies, for example, on quats and their effects on children.
Okay.
Limited.
So so from the point of view of an exposure scientist, what are some of the main things that govern the level of exposure? Like, what are the typical avenues of exposure? An inhalation of aerosols, or like touching a surface and putting your hand in your mouth? Like, what can you tell me about how exposure typically happens?
To the disinfectants?
Yeah, right. When people, whether they're cleaning at home or it's a clinical setting, hospital setting, have you studied that? Like, what are the typical methods that these products get into people?
Sure. The different routes of exposure are going to depend on the manner in which the product is applied, right? So if you have, like, somebody is using a fogger, for example, then inhalation might be, a potential route of concern. Also, non-dietary ingestion, such as hand to mouth, if you've touched a contaminated surface, but that's less likely. It's more likely that the main route of exposure is through airborne, so inhalation of these chemicals.
Okay. So, do you study the volatilization, the vapor pressure of these chemicals? Is it different as they're applied to different surfaces? Like, if I spray a cleaner on a vinyl surface versus a tile surface versus, if I'm spraying it up high versus down low, like, are there basic cleaning procedures that at least can be communicated to staff that would use the products, so they use them in a way that minimizes aerosolization or, vaporization off surfaces?
So always increasing and having good ventilation in indoor spaces is a good procedure in practice. And it really depends on what chemical you're using and to follow the proper label, following the labels on these products. But in general, there are so many things that you have to keep in mind, right? Like, who is going to be occupying this space? Do you really need it? Are you ventilating the area while you're performing the cleaning, disinfection? Are you also ventilating the area during other times? So, having good ventilation system is going to be key no matter what you use or not use, because you want to make sure you get in free, fresh air.
Yeah, no, that's good. But a lot of these buildings over the past 30 years, they're made with windows you can't open. So they have air handling systems, which is wonderful. And they may have nice filters in them and everything, but still within a given room, if you're in there and a nurse is in there, or the orderly comes in, a janitor starts spraying stuff, they don't seem to be too concerned with ventilation or anything. I guess they assume that everything will be fine. What else can be done besides ventilate better? What if you can't? Is a fan enough? What do you do?
Like I said, proper hygiene procedures are good. Also, cleaning surfaces. It's very important to clean than to worry about, disinfecting and sanitizing, because there is a difference between them.
What's the difference?
So there is a difference. So cleaning refers to, removing the actual dirt and germs and impurities from surfaces or objects. And all you need is soap and, water for this. And then there's sanitizing, which reduces the bacteria on surfaces to the levels that are considered generally safe for public health. And then there's disinfecting, which is the whole point of disinfecting is to destroy infectious germs and, viruses and bacteria on different surfaces.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
So is the first level of cleaning a surface cleaning the debris off of it, and a second level disinfecting it? How do you, if I've got,
That's correct.
If I've got a counter with crap all over it,
Yes.
I wipe off the counter, now I've cleaned it. And then next step is, would I go round 2 and I spray a compound on it, and that's disinfecting what's left?
It depends on the setting. What people don't realize is that soap and water is very effective against a virus. The virus, the way it works is that it has an outer layer, a lipid layer or fatty layer, if you will. And the soap and water is able to cut through this layer and, destroying the virus. So sometimes cleaning is sufficient, depending on the setting.
Okay. I haven't asked you this, but what is your opinion of these quat cleaners? Are they useful? Are they just what's available? Are they dangerous in your opinion? What do you think about them?
So like I said, there are over 200 quats that are approved for use by the EPA, again, based on their efficacy against the virus, not necessarily any pre-market safety testing and potential effects on human health. What we know about them is that acute effects have been shown, such as respiratory effects, dermal, occupational asthma, for example, in cleaners who have used them in the past, or even farm workers, as well as reproductive outcomes in animal studies.
Well, I just think that's kind of weird that they would be approved by the EPA, but yet people don't really fully understand how they could affect human health. It doesn't sound like a very smart thing to do on the EPA's part.
I agree, and I think in the U.S. in general, we have a reactive rather than a proactive approach when it comes to chemical safety. Unfortunately, a lot of products do not have to, they do not undergo pre-market safety testing. We're often left with, trying to figure out whether they cause a health effect or not after the fact. And it's a misconception that, people assume that because a product is out there, it is safe for human consumption, but it may or may not.
Right.
Oftentimes we don't find out till later on that these products may be associated with health effects.
When you talk about vulnerable populations, is there safety data showing that kids or pregnant women or other groups are more vulnerable, or?
Absolutely, yes. So in general, right? In general, and this is like for chemical exposures in general. Women of reproductive age, pregnant women and children tend to be more vulnerable to chemical exposures for many reasons. So number one, for pregnant women, their fetus is still developing. And so it could be that exposure to different chemicals either during the entire pregnancy or during a certain trimester when the fetus is still developing could have long-lasting impacts. For children, for the same reason, they're still developing. For example, the respiratory system of a child does not finish developing until early adolescence. And so chemical exposures during this critical window of susceptibility could increase the risk of potential health effects, including respiratory and others. So we have seen that, these are populations that are more vulnerable, if you will, to the potential health effects of different chemicals, including pesticides, which disinfectants fall into the category of pesticides. We have seen both in farm worker populations and urban populations that certain classes of pesticides can have a lasting impact on cognition, for example, and children's behaviors as well.
I know, is there any evidence starting to come out on the zealous cleaning that seems to be going on everywhere, whether it's effective and whether it's negatively impacting people's health, or at this point, does no one really care yet?
There is to my knowledge, no human data on potential health effects or, that I have actually looked at the health effects in children or other vulnerable populations. However, one concern that we have in our field is that not only are children vulnerable in general, but also you may have a lot of people or children with pre-existing conditions such as asthma, for example. And so, all we're doing is spraying more chemicals into their environment, which may make their asthma worse. So this is something that is a concern.
Yeah, I have asthma, and definitely those chemicals make it worse. So I try to stay away from when they're spraying, and I tell them not to do that, Right.
And a lot of these, the EPA approves them for use, and they also on the labels make sure that they're approving it for a certain application, right? There's different ways of applying these different pesticides. These quats have been shown to linger and to stay after they've been sprayed for months. That's right, another concern that we have, that you're prolonging an exposure, and depending on how often there's reapplication going on, then we're talking about, increasing somebody's exposure who's occupying these spaces in which these chemicals are being applied.
Yeah, that's insane. What about the microbes associated with, I don't know, have they looked at, have studies been done to look at surfaces pre-spray and post-spray, and then ones that are sprayed regularly? What happens to the microbes that tend to gather there? I'm sure it changes them quite a bit, and ones that are resistant to the quats start to accumulate there.
So, in general, I feel like there's this misconception that if we spray or we go in and fog, that it's going to, quote unquote, clean the air and disinfect the air. However, that's not necessarily the case. It's not going to necessarily clean the air. The particle physics behind it is going to prevent most of these particles from colliding with each other. In other words, from the chemical reaching the virus particles. And also, depending on how it's sprayed or applied, for example, a fogger, it doesn't efficiently cover surfaces. So it depends on many factors such as direction of the spray, the particle size, the distance, and other factors as well. So it creates a sense of, a false sense of security, if you will.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, what do you sense is the sensitivity of even talking about this stuff? Do you think that, if you wanted to do research on it, would it be approved? Or in this climate, everyone's like just clean stuff and they're going crazy with cleaning and they don't care? Like, do you think that there's even any desire of anyone to consider that these could be harmful right now?
I get, the priority, it seems like the general public of not getting the virus, right? So I think that the use of cleaners, the uses of disinfectants is not really a topic that's being paid a lot of attention to, right? We're worried more about killing the virus and not like other repercussions or other things that could happen as a result of us using all these, this arsenal of different chemicals in different spaces. Would research like this be approved? I believe so. I think they're here to stay for a while. And it all depends on the course of how we're able to contain the virus, vaccine development, et cetera. But I think this should be looked at, right? Like the effects of quaternary ammonium compounds on human health, if they are going to be continued to be used.
Yeah, no, I agree. Interesting. Are there studies of people that I always wonder about those poor people that work in nail salons, breathing in that crap for months and years. Are there studies of people that work in environments that use tons of these cleaners all the time and what happens to their health, their cardiovascular or other health?
To my knowledge, I have not seen studies focusing on these populations on disinfectants. I am actually doing some work on the side trying to start studying chemical exposures among, for example, hairdressers.
Yeah, that's crazy. They should. I mean,
Absolutely.
I can't imagine that. Again, imagine you work in a nail salon or you're a hairdresser and you're spraying hairspray, 50 times a day and breathing that stuff in. And those places are never ventilated properly, It's always like, wow. I just can't imagine that those people don't have like massive health problems over time, So what are some studies that you'd love to do?
I would love to look at what are the potential health effects of these quaternary ammonium compounds long term on populations that have had to use them, for example, cleaners, right? There has been an increase in use not only in cleaners but also healthcare workers. And because of a general lack of knowledge and the need, for example, to reuse personal protective equipment, for example, there was a case in Washington State where healthcare workers were wearing face shields and they were actually cleaning them inside with a lot of these harsher disinfectant, which is like the most awful thing to do, right? Like you're constantly breathing that in all day. Like I said, these, depending on the material in which the disinfectant is sprayed on, it could last longer than intended. And so, there are other alternatives. And I think we need to start raising awareness as to what better alternatives are rather than using these harsher chemicals, especially when we're talking about extremely vulnerable populations, for example, those who already have pre-existing conditions like asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or any other health issues, as well as, children and pregnant women or women of reproductive age.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, very good. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at FindingGeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.